Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from the frozen depths of winter isolation. These are tales of people who ventured into snow-covered wilderness and found something ancient waiting in the cold. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. My uncle left me his property up near Copper Ridge when he passed in late November. I didn't even know he owned land up there, we weren't close, and he'd been a recluse for the last 15 years of his life. The lawyer said it was a small cabin, maybe 40 acres of woods, and that I should probably see it before deciding whether to sell. I was 29, working remotely anyway, so I figured why not spend a few days up there. Get away from the city. The drive up took longer than expected. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, and the county roads weren't exactly a priority for plows. The cabin sat in a clearing that felt too perfect, too deliberately carved out of the surrounding pines. My uncle's truck was still parked beside it, buried under snow up to the wheel wells. The cabin itself was small, maybe 600 square feet, with a stone chimney and windows so old the glass had that wavy quality to it. Inside, everything was neat, too neat. My uncle's coat still hung by the door. His coffee cup sat in the sink, unwashed. The place smelled like coal and cedar and something else I couldn't quite identify, slightly sweet, slightly wrong. I got a fire going in the woods and unpacked my things. The sun was already setting, it was barely 4:30, and I noticed my uncle had nailed something above every window and door. Little bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread. They looked old, the herbs brittle and colorless. I figured it was some folk superstition thing. My uncle had always been odd. That first night, I made dinner and tried to get cell service. Nothing. The satellite internet box he had wasn't working either. I ate canned soup and read by lantern light. The electricity was on, but the lights kept flickering, so I didn't trust them. Around 9 p.m. I heard something outside, not an animal sound, more like someone walking through the snow, that distinct crunch-crunch rhythm. I went to the window and looked out, but the darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just black pressing against the glass. The walking sound circled the cabin, slow, methodical. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk, but it stopped directly at the back window, the one over the kitchen sink, and I heard breathing. Slow, wet breathing like someone with fluid in their lungs. I stood very still, my dinner forgotten, listening. Then it moved on, continuing around the cabin until the sound faded into the woods. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, a creak on the porch, a scratch against the logs, a soft thump on the roof. At one point around 3 a.m. I could swear I heard my name, just once, whispered from somewhere outside. David, my uncle's voice. The next morning I went outside to check. The snow around the cabin was pristine, no tracks, nothing. I walked the entire perimeter twice. Whatever had been out there either hadn't disturbed the snow, or the overnight snowfall had covered everything. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the back wall of the cabin, at eye level, someone had drawn a symbol in what looked like ash. A circle with radiating lines, and in the center, a handprint. I went back inside and really looked at those herb bundles. Upon closer inspection, I could see tiny scratches in the wood around them, claw marks almost, like something had tried to tear them down but stopped. My mouth went dry. I wanted to leave right then, but I also felt stupid. It was broad daylight. Nothing had actually happened. I spent the day exploring the property, trying to shake off the unease. My uncle had a trail that led into the woods, marked with faded orange tape on trees. I followed it for maybe 20 minutes until I came to a clearing where 3 large stones stood in a triangle. They were covered in the same symbols I'd seen on the cabin wall. And hanging from the trees around the clearing were dozens of those herb bundles, swaying slightly in the breeze even though the air was completely still. In the center of the triangle there was a hole, not a natural depression, a deliberately dug hole maybe 3 feet across, lined with flat stones. I approached it carefully and looked down. It was deep, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and at the bottom I could see something pale. I thought it might be snow, but snow doesn't have texture like that. It looked organic, almost like skin. I backed away from the clearing and hurried back to the cabin, that animal part of my brain screaming that I'd seen something I shouldn't have. When I got back, the front door was open. I knew I'd closed it. I stood on the porch, heart hammering, and called out, no answer. I went inside slowly, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing. But my uncle's coat, the one that had been hanging by the door, was now on the floor in front of the wood stove. And it was wet, like it had been outside in the snow. That night I pushed the kitchen table against the front door and sat in a chair facing it with my uncle's hunting knife in my lap. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to sit here until dawn and then I was leaving. Around midnight the breathing started again, this time right outside the front door. I could hear it through the wood, slow and congested. Then something pressed against the door. The table scraped forward an inch, then another inch. I stood up, gripping the knife, my whole body shaking. Get away, I said, and my voice cracked. The pressure on the door stopped. For maybe 30 seconds there was silence. Then I heard it move to the window on my left. I turned, and through the wavy glass I saw something. A face, pressed right up against the window, pale and wrong, with eyes that were too far apart and a mouth that didn't quite close properly. It was looking directly at me. I ran to the back of the cabin, to the bedroom, and locked the door. The window in there was small, and thank God, it still had one of those herb bundles above it. I could hear movement in the main room, the scrape of chair legs on wood, footsteps that were too heavy, too deliberate, then silence. I waited, knife raised, pressed into the corner between the bed and the wall. After what felt like hours, I heard the front door open and close, then nothing. I stayed in that bedroom until I saw gray light around the curtains. When I finally came out, the main room was empty. The table was still against the door, but my uncle's coat was now hanging by the door again, perfectly placed on its hook. And on the kitchen table, arranged in a neat line, were 7 small stones. Each one had that same symbol carved into it. I threw everything into my truck and left. Didn't even close up the cabin properly. When I got back to town, I went straight to the county records office. I needed to know something. The woman behind the desk was helpful. She pulled up the property records and I asked her about my uncle. When did he die? She gave me a confused look. That property has been in your family for generations, she said. But according to this, the last resident abandoned it in 1987. I told her that was impossible. My uncle just died 2 months ago. She turned her screen so I could see it. The property had been vacant for 39 years. I sold it to the county for whatever they'd give me. Never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that breathing. And 3 months after I got home, I found something in my coat pocket, a small stone with a symbol carved into it. I never put it there. Story 2. The winter I turned 34, my best friend Natalie convinced me to rent a cabin with her up in the Bitterroot Mountains. She was going through a divorce and needed to get away, and I just quit a job that had been slowly crushing my soul, so it felt like good timing. The rental listing showed a beautiful A-frame right on the edge of a frozen lake, completely isolated. Perfect. We loaded up her Subaru with enough groceries for a week and headed up in mid-January. The drive was stunning, everything covered in pristine white, the kind of quiet you never get in the city. The rental company had texted us the door code and said they wouldn't be able to check on us during our stay because the roads were unreliable, but that there was a satellite phone inside for emergencies. We arrived just before sunset, and the cabin was even better than the photos. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake, a massive stone fireplace, a loft bedroom that Natalie immediately claimed. We spent the first evening drinking wine and watching the stars come out. The lake was completely frozen, covered in snow, stretching out for maybe a quarter mile before the far shore. There were no other cabins visible, no lights anywhere except ours. Natalie kept saying it was exactly what she needed: total peace, total silence. I agreed, though something about all that emptiness made me slightly uncomfortable. I'm a city person. I like noise. On the second day, we decided to walk out on the lake. The ice was easily 2 feet thick according to the rental listing, safe until March. We bundled up and stepped out onto the snow-covered surface. Our boots squeaked against it, and the cold was so sharp it hurt to breathe. We made it maybe 100 yards out when Natalie stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened. At first, nothing. Then I heard it too, a low creaking sound, like a tree branch bending. But there were no trees anywhere near us. The sound seemed to be coming from below, from the ice itself. We stood still, listening. The creaking happened again, longer this time, and I could feel it vibrate through my boots. "We should head back," I said, and Natalie nodded. We turned around, and that's when I saw them, handprints, in the snow pressed into the surface about 10 feet to our left. Small handprints like a child's. They weren't there when we walked past. I know they weren't there. "Natalie," I said quietly, pointing. She saw them too. We both stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. The prints led away from us, heading toward the far shore, maybe 20 sets of them in a line, and they were fresh. The snow was still collapsing inward around the edges. Natalie pulled out her phone and took a picture, though we both knew there was no service out here. "Maybe someone else is renting nearby," she offered, but we'd checked. The nearest property was 4 miles away, and it was listed as seasonal, closed for winter. We walked back to the cabin faster than we'd walked out. Once inside, we locked the door, and I felt stupid for being spooked by handprints. Kids, probably, I told myself, though that didn't explain how they appeared behind us without us hearing anyone. We made lunch and tried to shake it off, but neither of us wanted to go back outside. We kept looking out the windows at the lake, at the tree line on the far shore. Everything was still, empty. That night around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. Soft, persistent, like someone dragging their fingernails down the outside of the glass. I was sleeping on the pull-out couch downstairs, and the scratching was coming from the big lake-facing windows right next to me. I lay there frozen, listening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Slow and rhythmic. I wanted to call out to Natalie, but my throat wouldn't work. The scratching moved across the window, left to right, then stopped. I waited in the dark, barely breathing. Then I heard it on the door. The same scratching, centered right where the handle was. I finally managed to move and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. The scratching stopped immediately. I shone the light toward the door, then the windows. Nothing, just darkness pressing against the glass. I climbed the ladder to the loft and woke Natalie. She was groggy, annoyed. "It's just the wind," she mumbled. "Tree branches." I didn't argue, but there were no trees close enough to touch the cabin. The next morning I went outside to check, and there in the snow beside the windows and the door were tracks. Not animal tracks, not human either. They looked like handprints, but elongated, with finger marks that were too long, pressed deep into the snow. They circled the entire cabin. I took photos with shaking hands. When I showed Natalie, she went pale. "Okay," she said slowly. "Maybe we should leave." But when we tried to start her car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine wouldn't even click. We popped the hood. Neither of us are mechanics, but we looked anyway. The battery cables were disconnected. Not broken, disconnected deliberately. We went back inside and locked the door, and that's when Natalie found the satellite phone. It was in the kitchen drawer where the listing said it would be. She turned it on, but the screen just showed a blinking red light. Dead battery or out of range. We were stuck. The day dragged on. We kept the fire going, kept all the curtains closed. Every sound made us jump. The house settling, the wind, the ice on the lake cracking and groaning. As evening came, Natalie said something I'd been thinking but hadn't wanted to voice. What if something doesn't want us to leave? Night fell and we pushed the couch against the door. We sat in the loft together, lights on, waiting. Around 11 p.m., we heard footsteps on the porch. Clear, distinct footsteps, walking slowly back and forth. Then the doorknob rattled. We huddled together, not speaking. The rattling stopped, and for a few minutes it was quiet. Then the scratching started again, this time on all the windows at once. A coordinated sound like multiple hands working in rhythm. I made myself look out the loft window, the small one that faced the lake, and I saw them, figures standing on the ice. 5, maybe 6 of them, pale and naked despite the cold. Their proportions were wrong, arms too long, heads too large. They were completely still, facing the cabin. As I watched, one of them raised its arm and pointed directly at me. Its hand had too many fingers. "Don't look," Natalie whispered, pulling me back. We sat on the floor of the loft, backs to the wall, listening to the scratching continue for hours. At some point, I must have dozed off because I jerked awake to silence. Gray dawn light was filtering through the windows. The scratching had stopped. Natalie was already up, looking exhausted. We went downstairs carefully. Everything looked normal. We tried the car again. This time it started immediately. We threw our stuff into the back seat in under 5 minutes and got the hell out of there. As we pulled away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. In every window, pressed against the glass, were handprints. Small ones, covering the glass completely. We drove 3 hours straight, didn't stop until we hit civilization. A week later, I got a call from the rental company. They wanted to know if we'd had any issues. I asked them about previous renters. There was a long pause. "You're the first people to stay there this season," the woman said. Then she asked if we'd noticed anything unusual. I told her about the handprints, the figures on the ice. Another long pause. "The property has a history," she finally said. "A family drowned in that lake in the 1960s. 5 children. They fell through the ice. I haven't been able to look at snow the same way since. And sometimes, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I swear I can hear that scratching." A story 3. I took a job as a wildlife monitor up in the Sawtooth Range the winter I was 31. It was a 3-week solo gig, basically staying in a remote Forest Service cabin and documenting animal movements through camera traps. The pay was decent, and I liked the idea of solitude. I just ended a relationship and wanted space to think. They dropped me off by snowmobile in early February with supplies, a radio, and a thick binder of protocols. The cabin was basic but functional: 1 room, a wood stove, a cot, solar panels on the roof that mostly worked. The first week was perfect. I'd ski out each day to check the cameras, document tracks, watch the wilderness do its thing. I saw elk, a few coyotes, even a wolverine once. The nights were cold but manageable, and I'd spend them reading by lantern light or writing in my journal. The silence was profound, not the absence of sound, but a presence of its own. On the 8th day, I found something strange on one of my camera traps. The SD card had over 300 photos from the previous night, all taken within a 3-hour window. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes an animal will trigger a camera repeatedly, but every single photo was the same. just darkness. No animal, no glowing eyes, nothing, just pitch black frames. The camera was working fine otherwise. I moved that camera to a different location and didn't think too much about it. Equipment glitches happen. But that night I heard something I hadn't heard before. A voice, distant, barely audible over the wind, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. I went to the window and looked out into the moonlit snow. Nothing moved. The voice came again, and this time I could swear it sounded like my name. Riley, long and drawn out, almost like a question. I stood at the window for maybe 10 minutes, watching. The voice didn't come again. I convinced myself it was wind through the trees, the way sound can play tricks in the wilderness. But I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about those blank photos, about the voice, about how far I was from anyone. The next day I checked the camera I'd relocated. Another 400 photos, all blank, but the timestamp showed they'd been taken during the exact hours I'd heard the voice. I sat in the snow looking at the camera, trying to logic it out. Maybe condensation on the lens. I wiped it clean, checked all the settings. Everything was fine. I strapped on my skis and headed back to the cabin, and that's when I noticed the tracks. They were in the snow beside my trail, paralleling my path. Not animal tracks. Boot prints, human-sized, except they were spaced wrong, each step about 6 feet apart, like whoever made them was taking impossibly long strides or jumping. I followed them with my eyes and felt my chest tighten. The tracks came from the direction of the blank camera and led straight toward my cabin. I skied fast, no longer enjoying the exercise. When I got back, I circled the cabin before going inside. The tracks stopped about 20 feet from the door, right at the edge of the clearing. Just stopped, like whoever made them had evaporated. There were no return tracks, no indication they'd walked away. I went inside and locked the door, which was pointless. The lock was just a simple latch, but it made me feel slightly better. That evening I tried the radio. I wasn't supposed to check in until day 14, but I wanted to hear another human voice. Static. I tried all the frequencies. Nothing but static and occasional pops that almost sounded like words but weren't. I ate dinner mechanically, not tasting anything, watching the windows. Full dark came around 6 p.m. and I kept the lantern burning bright. Around 9 the voice came again. Closer this time, right outside the cabin. Riley, definitely my name. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the beam just reflected back at me off the dark glass. I couldn't see out. My hands were shaking. Who's there? I called out. Silence then. Riley opened the door. It was my ex's voice, perfect imitation. She was 400 miles away, but it was unmistakably her voice, her inflection. My brain tried to rationalize it, coincidence, auditory hallucination, stress, but my body knew better. Every muscle was rigid, my heart slamming against my ribs. Riley, I'm cold, please. The voice was patient, almost kind. I backed away from the door to the far corner of the cabin and sat with my back to the wall, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The voice continued, sometimes coaxing, sometimes just saying my name. It never got angry. That was somehow worse. This went on for hours. At some point I realized the voice wasn't coming from one location. It moved around the cabin, sometimes at the door, sometimes at the window, sometimes on the roof. Always calm, always patient. Around 2 a.m. it stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it hurt my ears. I didn't move. I sat in that corner until I saw gray light through the window. When dawn finally came, I packed. I didn't care about the job, the pay, the protocols. I was leaving. I'd ski to the main trail and flag down the next patrol. But when I opened the door, I stopped. In the snow, arranged in a perfect circle around the cabin, were objects from inside. My journal, a spoon, my spare socks. items that had been in the cabin with me while the door was locked. And in the center of the clearing, standing upright in the snow, was one of my skis. I'd leaned both skis against the inside wall by the door before going to sleep. I stood there trying to make sense of it. When had these things been taken? I'd been awake all night watching. I would have heard the door. I grabbed my remaining ski and the poles and started walking, not skiing. I couldn't with just one ski. The snow was hard-packed enough to walk on if I was careful. I made it maybe a quarter mile before I realized something was following me. Not walking, not making sound, but I could feel it. That pressure on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty, but in the trees, maybe 50 feet off the path, something pale moved behind a trunk. Just a flash there and gone. I walked faster, my breath coming in gasps. Every few minutes I'd turn around. Never saw it directly, but always that movement in the periphery, keeping pace. Never closer, never farther. It took me 6 hours to reach the main trail. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning. A Forest Service truck was there, pure luck. They were checking a gate. I must have looked insane, stumbling out of the woods with one ski, gasping. They drove me out, asking questions I barely answered. When we passed the turnoff to the cabin, I made myself look down the trail. Standing at the far end, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Tall and thin, too thin, with arms that hung down past where knees should be. I told them I quit. They could keep the pay, I didn't care. One of the rangers, an older woman named Barbara, gave me a long look. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "We stopped sending people to that cabin alone." I asked her why they'd sent me then. She shook her head. "You weren't supposed to be alone. Thomas was supposed to go with you, but he backed out last minute. We hoped it would be fine." They found my missing ski a week later when they went to close up the cabin. It was on the roof, driven through the solar panel like a spear. The journal and other items were never recovered, and every camera I'd placed in the field had thousands of blank photos. But one camera, the one I'd moved twice, had a single image that wasn't blank. It showed the cabin at night, lights on, and in the window, you could see me sitting with my back to the wall. And behind me, even though I'd been alone, there was something else in the frame. Tall, impossibly thin, standing right behind me. I don't do solo work anymore. I don't care how much it pays. A story 4. My grandfather died in December and left me his hunting lodge up near the Canadian border. I'd been there once as a kid, maybe 20 years ago, and barely remembered it. My mom said I should at least check on the place before the estate was settled, make sure pipes hadn't burst, that kind of thing. I drove up 2 days after Christmas with my buddy Marcus. He'd grown up hunting with his dad and knew how to winterize a cabin properly. Plus, I didn't want to go alone. The place was remote, an hour from the nearest town, down a logging road that barely counted as a road. We arrived in the afternoon, the sun already low and weak. The lodge was bigger than I remembered, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and large windows facing a clearing. Behind it, the forest was dense, the kind of old-growth timber that feels prehistoric. Marcus whistled appreciatively. "Your grandfather had good taste," he said. We unloaded our overnight bags and went inside. The interior smelled like old wood and smoke, but it was tidy. My grandfather had kept it clean. There was a gun cabinet in the main room, locked, mounted heads on the walls, deer, elk, something that might have been a mountain goat. In the kitchen, we found food in the pantry, some of it recent. Crackers dated from 3 months ago. My grandfather had died 4 months ago. Marcus noticed me staring at them. Maybe he had a caretaker, he suggested. We spent the rest of the afternoon checking the property. Pipes were fine, generator worked. There was a shed out back with firewood and some old traps. As the sun set, We got a fire going in the main room and cooked dinner. It was peaceful, comfortable. We talked about childhood memories, about my grandfather. He'd been a quiet man, intense. A decorated Marine who didn't talk about the war. He'd spent every winter up here alone, sometimes for weeks at a time. Around 10 p.m., Marcus went upstairs to bed. I stayed up reading, enjoying the fire. Around midnight, I heard a thump from upstairs. "Marcus," I called. No answer. I waited, listening. Another thump, then footsteps crossing the room above me. Marcus's room, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. I climbed the stairs and knocked on his door. "You okay?" "Yeah, why?" His voice was groggy. I opened the door. He was in bed, clearly had been sleeping. "I heard footsteps up here," I said. He sat up, frowning. We both listened. The lodge was silent except for the wind outside. "Old houses make noise," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I went back downstairs and added more wood to the fire, suddenly not tired at all. An hour later, I heard it again. Footsteps upstairs, but this time they crossed the hallway and started coming down the stairs. Slow, measured steps. I stood up, heart pounding, and watched the staircase. No one appeared. The footsteps stopped halfway down, and then there was nothing. "Marcus," I shouted. He came out of his room, looking annoyed and worried. "What?" "You didn't hear that?" He shook his head. We stood there on different floors, looking at each other. "Something's walking around up here," I said. We searched the entire second floor together, all 4 bedrooms, the bathroom, the storage closet. Nothing, no signs of anyone. But in my grandfather's room, the one Marcus wasn't using, we found something odd. The closet door was open. I was certain it had been closed earlier. Inside, pushed to the back, was a wooden box. Marcus pulled it out. It wasn't locked. Inside were dozens of photographs, all of the forest around the lodge. Trees, trails, the clearing, but in every photo there were markings, circles drawn in red ink around specific areas. And beneath each photo, my grandfather had written notes in his cramped handwriting. "Saw it here. 11 days. Movement, no tracks. It knows." The dates ranged over the last 3 years. "Your grandfather was tracking something," Marcus said, flipping through the photos. The last photo was different. It showed the lodge itself, taken from the tree line at night. The windows were lit, and in the foreground, partially out of frame, was something pale, an arm maybe, or a leg. The photo was blurry, like my grandfather had taken it quickly while moving. On the back, he'd written, "It came to the house. Don't open the door." We looked at each other, and without discussing it, went back downstairs together. I threw the box into the fire before Marcus could protest. I didn't want those photos in the house. We pushed a couch in front of the door and sat together, not speaking. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, and beneath the wind I could swear I heard scratching, soft, rhythmic scratching on wood. "It's on the porch," Marcus whispered. We sat frozen, listening. The scratching moved along the front of the house, testing the windows, the door. At one point, the doorknob rattled. The couch we'd pushed against it didn't move, but we both watched it like it might explode. Then the scratching moved around the side of the house, and we heard it climb. Actually heard it climbing the logs, ascending to the second floor. Marcus grabbed my arm. "We need to leave." But I was thinking about my grandfather's note. "Don't open the door. If we went outside, we'd be exposed. At least in here we had walls." The scratching reached the second floor and moved across the outside wall, stopping at one of the bedroom windows. We heard the window rattle in its frame. "Did we lock the windows?" I asked. Marcus went pale. "I don't know." We ran upstairs and checked every window. They were all locked. But in my grandfather's room, the one with the closet, the window lock was broken. Old wood, corroded metal. The window was closed but not secured. As we stood there staring at it, something pressed against the glass from outside. We couldn't see what, it was too dark, and our reflection on the glass obscured everything. But we saw the print it left, a handprint but wrong. The fingers were too long and jointed in too many places. We backed out of the room and slammed the door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle. "We are leaving," Marcus said, and this time I agreed. We went downstairs, grabbed our coats and moved the couch. I opened the door carefully, flashlight raised. The porch was empty. Our truck was 30 feet away. We ran for it, feet pounding on frozen ground, and Marcus fumbled with the keys. The engine started, and we reversed out so fast we almost hit a tree. As we turned around, our headlights swept across the porch. Something was standing there, tall, maybe 7 feet, with pale skin that looked too tight over elongated bones. Its arms were at its sides, fingers nearly touching the porch floor. It had a face, but the features were in the wrong places. Eyes too low, mouth too wide. It didn't move as we stared at it. Then it raised one hand and waved. A slow, deliberate wave, like it was saying goodbye. Marcus floored it, and we didn't stop driving until we hit the main highway an hour later. We sat in a gas station parking lot, heater blasting, neither of us speaking. Finally, Marcus said, "Your grandfather knew." Yeah, he knew. And he'd stayed there anyway, every winter, watching. Maybe protecting something, maybe being protected from something. I don't know. I sold the property to a developer 6 months later. Took a loss, didn't care. The lodge was demolished to make way for vacation condos. I hope whatever was there is gone. But sometimes I wonder if my grandfather had been keeping it contained, and by leaving, by burning those photos, by tearing the lodge down, we let something loose. I still have nightmares about that wave. The story 5. I'm a writer, and I'd been struggling with a deadline for months. My editor suggested I do what a lot of writers do, find a remote place and force myself to focus. I found a rental through some obscure website, a winterized cabin in the White Mountains. It was cheap, available immediately, and the photos showed exactly what I needed: a desk, a fireplace, isolation. I packed my laptop and enough supplies for 2 weeks and drove up in late January. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small, clean, with a wood stove and large windows that let in the weak winter light. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, met me there to hand over the keys. He showed me how the generator worked, where the extra propane was stored, and then hesitated at the door. "You're staying alone?" he asked. I nodded. He frowned. "You seem like a sensible person, so I'll just say this: don't go into the root cellar. The door's in the kitchen floor, but it's locked." "Leave it locked." I must have looked confused because he continued. "I'm serious. My family has owned this land for 4 generations, and that's the one rule: don't open the cellar." I assured him I wouldn't. He left, and I settled in. The first few days were productive. I wrote more than I had in months, the isolation clearing my head. At night I'd make dinner, read, sleep well. On the 4th night I noticed the door. The root cellar door Frank had mentioned. It was in the kitchen floor, a wooden hatch with an iron ring. There was no visible lock, just the ring. I knelt beside it out of curiosity and tugged. It didn't budge. Either locked from below or just stuck from years of disuse. That night I heard something while I was trying to sleep. A rhythmic thumping coming from below the cabin. Slow, steady beats, like someone hammering something. Thump, thump, thump. I got up and stood in the kitchen listening. The sound was definitely coming from beneath the floor, from the direction of the root cellar. It continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I waited in the dark, but it didn't start again. The next morning I called Frank. I got his voicemail and left a message asking about the noise. He called back an hour later. "You heard something from the cellar?" His voice was tight. I told him about the thumping, long silence. "Ignore it," he finally said. "Do not open that door. I'll refund your money if you want to leave, but if you stay, do not open that door." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I told him I'd stay but promised to leave the door alone. The thumping happened every night after that, always starting around 2 a.m., always lasting about 5 minutes. I tried to ignore it, tried to work, but it was getting harder to focus. I kept thinking about what could be down there making that sound. An animal trapped. But the rhythm was too consistent, too deliberate. On the 8th night, the thumping changed. It became faster, more insistent, and it didn't stop after 5 minutes. It went on for an hour, then 2. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands over my ears, and still I could feel it vibrating through the floor. Then I heard something else, a voice, muffled like someone speaking through layers of cloth coming from the cellar. I couldn't make out words, but it was unmistakably human. "Hello," I called out. The voice stopped. The thumping stopped. Everything went silent. I stood there in my pajamas, staring at the hatch, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then the voice came again, louder. And this time I understood it. "Let me out." My rational brain tried to process this. Someone was trapped down there, someone needed help. But Frank's warning echoed in my head, "Don't open the door." "Who are you?" I asked. No answer. "Are you hurt?" Still nothing. Then the thumping started again, so loud it shook the coffee cup on the table. And beneath the thumping, I heard scratching like fingernails on wood, dozens of them all at once. I backed away from the hatch and went to the bedroom, closing the door. The sounds continued until dawn. When they finally stopped, I was exhausted, shaking. I should have left. I should have grabbed my things and driven away. But part of me, the stupid, curious part, needed to understand what was happening. I went back to the kitchen and knelt beside the hatch. The iron ring was cold under my fingers. I pulled gently. It still didn't move. That's when I noticed the symbols, carved into the wood around the hatch, worn smooth with age. They looked like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize, overlapping and intertwined. I took photos with my phone, thinking I'd research them later. As I was photographing, I noticed something I'd missed before. There were scratches on the underside of the iron ring. Fresh scratches, like metal scraping metal. That evening, I didn't cook. I sat in the main room with all the lights on, watching the kitchen. Around 1 a.m., I heard the voice again, not muffled this time, clear, coming from right beneath the hatch. "I know you can hear me." It was a man's voice, calm and patient. "I've been down here a very long time. Frank's family put me here. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, I just want to get out." The voice was so human, so reasonable. My hand drifted toward my phone. Should I call someone? The police? But what would I say? "There's something in the cellar. Why are you locked down there?" I asked. Silence. "Then, you'd have to ask Frank's grandfather. He's the one who put me here in 1952. I've been here ever since." That couldn't be right. 1952 was 74 years ago. No one could survive that long in a root cellar. "You're lying," I said. The voice laughed, a sound that made my stomach turn. "Frank told you not to open the door, didn't he? Ask yourself why. What's he protecting, me or you?" I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my laptop and researched the property, the family, anything I could find. There were a few old newspaper articles. In 1952, a man named William Cavina had gone missing near the property. Local speculation was he'd gotten lost in the woods. His body was never found, and Frank's grandfather, Robert, had died in 1955 under strange circumstances, fell and broke his neck in his own kitchen. The article mentioned that Robert had become increasingly paranoid before his death, claiming something was trying to get loose. The next night, the voice was different, angry. "You've been reading about me, William, that's my name. They locked me down here because I saw something in the woods I shouldn't have. Something that's still out there. Robert thought he could keep it contained by keeping me here. But I'm not the problem, I never was. Open the door and I'll explain everything." I wanted to believe him. Part of me did believe him. But another part, the part that trusted Frank's fear, kept me from touching that hatch. "If you've been down there since 1952, why aren't you dead?" I asked. The voice didn't answer for a long time. When it did, it was barely a whisper. "I am dead, that's the problem." Something in my chest went cold. I stood up and walked to the hatch. I knelt beside it and looked at the symbols again. They weren't decorative. They were a seal, a binding. "What are you really?" I asked. The voice that answered wasn't the man's voice anymore. It was multiple voices speaking in unison, layered and wrong. "Open the door and find out." I packed my things in under 10 minutes. As I was leaving, I stopped and looked at the hatch one last time. The iron ring was moving, turning slowly, clockwise, like invisible hands were working it from below. I ran to my car and drove away, and I didn't stop until I was 3 towns over. I called Frank the next day and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. "My grandfather made a mistake," he finally said. "He tried to trap something and he used a man as bait. William's body is down there and so is whatever killed him. They're bound together. If that door opens..." He didn't finish. I never finished my book. I couldn't. Every time I tried to write, I'd hear that voice, those voices, asking me to let them out. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the thumping. A story 6. My cousin Jenna and I decided to spend a week cross-country skiing through the Boundary Waters in February. We're both experienced winter campers, and Jenna had mapped out a route that would take us through some remote sections we'd never explored. We started at a popular entry point, planning to ski about 8 miles a day, camp, and loop back. The weather forecast was good, cold, but stable. We loaded our sleds with gear and set off on a bright morning, the snow squeaking under our skis. The first 2 days were perfect. We saw no one, which was expected for that time of year. The frozen lakes were like highways, easy skiing. We camped on islands, cooked over our stove, slept well. On the 3rd day, we decided to take a side route Jenna had found on an old map, a portage that supposedly connected 2 lakes through a narrow valley. The trail wasn't marked on modern maps, but Jenna loved finding forgotten paths. The portage was harder than expected. The trail was overgrown, and we had to take off our skis and drag our sleds through deep snow. It took us 3 hours to cover what should have been a mile. When we finally emerged at the second lake, we were exhausted. The lake was small, maybe half a mile across, surrounded by steep ridges. The ice looked solid, but there was something odd about it. Patterns in the snow, like wind, had carved designs, except there was no wind. We made camp on the north shore in a small clearing. As we were setting up the tent, Jenna found something, a cairn, a pile of stones stacked deliberately. "Someone's been here," she said, though the stones looked old, covered in lichen. Near the cairn was a piece of wood, maybe part of an old sign. Carved into it were words barely legible, "Turn back, water is wrong." We laughed it off, some old cautionary marker from decades ago, but setting up camp, we both felt uneasy. The valley was too quiet, no birds, no wind. Just silence that seemed to press down on us. We got our stove going and made dinner, trying to shake the feeling. As darkness fell, Jenna pointed at the ice. "Do you see that?" I looked. In the center of the lake, maybe 200 yards out, there was movement. Not on the ice, under it. Something large, moving beneath the surface, creating ripples in the ice above it. We watched for several minutes, but the light was fading and it was hard to be sure. "Fish," Jenna said, not sounding convinced. "Big fish." We retreated to the tent and sealed ourselves in. Our sleeping bags were rated to -20, and we had a small battery-powered heater, so we were comfortable. Around 10 p.m. we heard it, a sound like ice cracking, a sharp report that echoed across the valley, then another and another. "The lake's freezing deeper," Jenna said, but the cracks weren't random. They were rhythmic, evenly spaced. Crack, crack, crack. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The moon was bright and I could see the lake clearly. The ice near the center was fracturing, lines spreading outward like a spiderweb. And in the center, something was rising, breaking through, a shape dark and wet, pulling itself up onto the surface. It was too far away to see clearly, but it was big, and it was moving toward shore. "Jenna," I said quietly. She crawled to the tent opening and looked. We watched as the shape crossed the ice, moving slowly but steadily. As it got closer, we could see it wasn't an animal. It had limbs, but too many of them, and they bent in ways that made no sense. When it reached the shore, it stopped maybe 50 feet from our tent. It stood there, if standing is the right word, and I realized it was looking at us. No eyes that I could see, but it was aware of us. Jenna grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." We packed faster than I've ever packed in my life, stuffing things into our sleds without any order. The shape didn't move, just watched. Or waited. We put on our skis, and the moment we did, it moved fast. Impossibly fast across the snow, closing the distance. We skied back the way we'd come into the portage trail, dragging our sleds, terror giving us energy we didn't know we had. Behind us we could hear it, not footsteps. A sliding, dragging sound like wet fabric on snow. And a clicking, a rapid clicking like mandibles. Jenna was ahead of me, and I didn't dare look back. We made it maybe half a mile before Jenna's sled caught on something and she went down. I stopped, helped her up, and that's when I made the mistake of turning around. It was right there, 20 feet away. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly. It didn't have a face. It had a mass of writhing appendages where a head should be, like tentacles or fingers, constantly moving. Its body was pale and slick, covered in something that looked like mucus. And it smelled, a smell like stagnant water, and rot that made my eyes water. Jenna screamed, and the sound seemed to startle it. The appendages where its face should be spread apart, and I saw something underneath. A mouth circular, filled with rows of tiny teeth. It made a sound, a low vibration I felt in my chest rather than heard. Then it lunged. We abandoned the sleds and ran, just ran, crashing through the snow without our skis, falling and getting up and running again. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours. At some point, we burst out onto the first lake, the one we'd crossed to get to the portage. Behind us, the forest was silent. No dragging sound, no clicking. We stood on the ice, gasping for air, looking back. Nothing emerged from the trees. We waited, shaking, for 10 minutes. Then we started walking, following our old ski trail back towards civilization. We walked through the night, not stopping. By dawn, we reached the entry point where we'd left Jenna's truck. We climbed in and locked the doors, and only then did we let ourselves fall apart. We sat there crying and shaking until the sun was fully up. When we finally calmed down enough to think, Jenna pulled out her phone. No service, but she'd taken photos the first 2 days. She scrolled through them and then stopped. "Oh God," she whispered. She showed me one of the photos from the second day when we'd been skiing across a large lake. In the background, barely visible, was the small lake we'd camped at. And standing on the ice, even though it was miles away, was a dark shape. It had been watching us before we even got there. We reported it to the Forest Service. They nodded politely and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe us. We never went back for our gear. It's still out there, our tent, our sleds, everything. And somewhere in that valley, something is waiting for the next people who don't heed the warning. I sold all my camping equipment. I don't go into the wilderness anymore, and I can't swim in lakes, can't even look at them without wondering what's underneath. Story 7. I inherited my aunt's house outside of Bangor the winter I turned 28. I'd barely known her. She was my father's sister, estranged from the family for reasons no one talked about. The lawyer said she'd lived alone for 30 years and died in her sleep. The house was paid off, and I was her only living relative, so it was mine if I wanted it. I was renting an apartment in Portland at the time, struggling with student loans, so a free house seemed like a gift. I drove up to see it in mid-February. The house was an old farmhouse, 2 stories with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. It sat on 10 acres, surrounded by woods, no neighbors visible. Inside, it was cluttered but clean. My aunt had been a collector, shelves filled with books, boxes of papers, jars of things I couldn't identify. The furniture was old but well maintained. It felt like stepping into the 1970s. I spent the first day just exploring, opening closets and drawers, trying to get a sense of who my aunt had been. In the master bedroom, I found journals, dozens of them dated going back to 1984. I flipped through a few. They were mostly mundane, whether observations, meal planning, gardening notes. But as I read further, a pattern emerged. Every few pages, she'd written the same phrase, "It came again last night." I found the earliest journal and started reading chronologically. The first mention was in March 1984. Something knocked on my bedroom window last night. 3 times I looked, but nothing was there, probably a branch. A week later, the knocking again. It's too rhythmic to be a branch. I've trimmed all the trees away from the house. A month later, it came again last night. I saw it this time, standing in the yard looking up at my window, tall, wrong, I don't know what it wants. I felt a chill reading that. The entries continued for years. My aunt had stopped trying to rationalize it. She wrote about seeing the visitor regularly, always at night, always watching the house. She called the police twice in the first year, but they found nothing. Eventually, she'd stopped calling. The entries became resigned, matter of fact. It came again last night, I didn't look. She learned to ignore it, apparently. The last journal entry was dated a week before she died. It hasn't come in 3 months. I don't know why. I should feel relieved, but I'm worried. In 30 years, it's never stayed away this long. What changed? That was it. No more entries. I sat in a bedroom holding the journal, looking out the window at the yard. The sun was setting, shadows stretching across the snow. I decided to stay the night. I needed to know if this was real or if my aunt had been mentally ill. I made dinner using food I'd brought, checked all the locks, and settled into the living room with more of her journals. Around 9 p.m. my phone died. I'd forgotten to bring a charger that fit the old outlets. No problem, I had a flashlight, and the house had electricity. I read until around 11, then decided to sleep. I took the guest bedroom upstairs, not wanting to sleep in my aunt's bed. The room was small with a window facing the side yard. I left the curtains open. If something came, I wanted to see it. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, watching the window. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, 3 knocks. Clear, deliberate knocks on glass, but not on my window, downstairs. I got up slowly and crept to the hallway. 3 more knocks coming from the back of the house. The kitchen. I went downstairs, flashlight off, moving by moonlight. In the kitchen, I stood to the side of the window and looked out. There was something in the yard, tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, standing 30 feet from the house. It was dark, silhouetted against the snow, but I could make out its shape. vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the head too narrow. As I watched, it raised one arm and knocked on an invisible surface 3 times, a pantomime of knocking. Then it stood still, waiting. My aunt's words echoed in my head, "I don't know what it wants." I stood there frozen as it waited in the yard. Minutes passed. Then it turned and walked into the woods, moving with a strange, gliding gait. When it disappeared into the trees, I locked every door and window, pulled all the curtains, and sat in the living room with the lights on until dawn. The next morning, I went outside to look. The snow in the yard was pristine, no footprints, no tracks of any kind. But on the kitchen window on the outside, there were marks. 3 spots where the glass was fogged, like someone had breathed on it. And below those, scratched into the frost, was a symbol, a circle with lines radiating from the center. I took a photo and went back inside. I called my father. It was time to ask about my aunt. He was reluctant, but finally told me the story. My aunt had been normal until 1984. Then she'd started claiming something was stalking her. She'd become increasingly paranoid, isolated. The family tried to get her help, but she refused. Eventually, they gave up. "We thought she was schizophrenic," my father said. "She cut off contact with everyone." I asked if anyone had ever seen what she'd claimed to see. Long silence. "Your grandmother went to visit her once," he finally said. She wouldn't talk about what happened, but she never went back. I packed my things and left that afternoon. Before I left, I went through the house one more time and found something in the attic. A box filled with photographs. Hundreds of them, all taken at night, all of the yard. In most of them, nothing unusual. But in about 20 photos, there it was. The figure, sometimes far away at the tree line, sometimes closer to the house. In one photo, it was right outside the kitchen window, its too long arm raised, knocking. The photos were dated across 30 years. I put the house on the market immediately. It sold fast. The price was good and the location was desirable. I didn't tell the buyers about my aunt's journals or the photos. Maybe I should have. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler, moved in March. I got a call from them 6 weeks later. The husband's voice was shaky. "Did your aunt ever mention seeing things outside at night?" I told them I didn't know what they were talking about and hung up. They sold the house 8 months later. Since then, it's been sold 3 more times. The current listing describes it as a fixer-upper with charm. The price keeps dropping. I check sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I look at the listing photos, at the windows, at the yard, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting in the trees, knocking on glass that no one inside dares to answer. My aunt lived there for 30 years, watching, being watched. I don't know which is worse, that she endured it for so long or that it waited until she died to start looking for someone new. Sometimes I dream about that figure in the yard. In the dreams, I'm back in that house and it's knocking 3 times, always 3 times. And I know that eventually I'm going to open the door. I haven't gone back to Maine. I don't think I ever will. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most. Was it the bone wire, the handprints on the ice, or something that followed someone home? Share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.